Hi everyone, my name is Leor Zmigrod. Thank you for coming to this virtual symposium, and thank you to the Cognitive Science Society for organizing this, and for the Robert Glushko and Pamela Samuelson Foundation for this lovely honor. So today I'll be talking about a topic that may initially seem like a little bit of foreign territory for the hardcore cognitive scientists, but which I really think can blossom into something that's both interesting and useful. And so I've titled this talk A Cognitive Science of Ideology and Dogmatism. And throughout, I will aim to show how cognitive science can produce truly fascinating insights about the origins of ideologies and of dogmatism and where the two intersect. And in many ways, the motivation and idea behind this research is captured in this depiction of this cartoon by Calvin and Hobbes, where Hobbes is asking, is it a right to remain ignorant? And Calvin says, I don't know, but I refuse to find out. And in many ways, I think the first question I'm interested in is what makes Hobbes's mind inquisitive and evidence-seeking, whereas Calvin is more dogmatic and evidence-resistant here. The second question is a bit more meta-theoretical, because I'm fascinated by the fact that although cognitive science is all about how the mind makes decisions, we have surprisingly little theory and research about what makes a particular mind dogmatic and what makes it a more ideological decision maker and information processor. There's actually remarkably little cognitive research on the psychological roots of dogmatism and what makes some brains more dogmatic or more ideological than others. So in this talk, I will broadly sketch out what I envision the cognitive science of ideology and dogmatism could look like, and to try to bring us closer to Hobbes's more inquisitive mindset, and to try to exemplify this through some of the research that I've conducted on the cognitive underpinnings of ideological dogmatism. So when psychologists have thought about ideologies, the first kind of idea that came out post-Holocaust was the effect of situations and how ideological doctrines impose themselves on individuals' brains. And so the idea that situations coerce people to obey and to behave in ideologically dogmatic ways was quite a dominant narrative. And this was followed somewhat sequentially, but also in tandem by a focus more on motivations, which sought to see how motivations to seek coherence, uncertainty, and belonging made some people more attracted to ideological doctrines than others. And both of these lines of research and stories are incredibly important and have a lot of truth to them. But today I'll actually posit something a little different, which is a focus on neurocognition and looking at, first of all, how cognitive traits that are not about motivations, that are really about how the brain processes information from its environment, how that predicts what makes some people more attracted to ideologies and doctrines in general, and also how ideological doctrines can then impose themselves back on cognition and back on the brain. And so when thinking about this question, the question that fascinates me most is, what is the relationship between low-level perception and cognition and susceptibility to ideological and dogmatic thinking? And like in any science, there are two main ways to approach this. And so the first approach I'll show is more theory-driven research, where we have theories that we design specific tests to help us see whether the theory is borne out in the data. And the second approach is a more data-driven approach, where we collect rich and large data sets and let the data speak to understand the relationships that exist. And so I'll start with theory-driven approaches to this question of ideological and dogmatic cognition. And actually, I mean, in social psychology, there is a rich history of theorizing on this field. And as Gordon Allport wrote in The Nature of Prejudice already in 1954, he wrote that a person's prejudice is unlikely to be merely a specific attitude toward a specific group. It is more likely to be a reflection of his or her whole habit of thinking about the world. And this theme, that the idea that our ideological attitudes and our dogmatic attitudes might reflect more generally on our cognition and our psychology, is a theme that we'll be coming back to in this talk a few times. And so the domain that I focused on in my theory-driven work was on cognitive rigidity, which is this tendency to perceive the world in more categorical binary ways. It's an inability to switch between modes of thinking, and this makes it difficult to adapt to changing reward contingencies and changing environments. And so the hypothesis that led to this work is the idea that ideological rigidity may actually be rooted in a more general cognitive rigidity. And so if we see this cartoon where it says, they only taught me how to think outside the box, I'm not trained for circles, this idea that a rigidity of the mind generally might translate into rigidity in other realms. And this is motivated by the idea that extreme group identities and ideological beliefs are often characterized by a tendency to rigidly categorize the world and people in quite an inflexible and essentialist manner. So the idea is that individuals with a more categorical, inflexible thinking style in general might tend to adhere to ideologies in a stricter or more extreme fashion. And so to study this, ran very large online studies with a few thousand participants, both in the US and the UK. And in all of these, we invite them to complete established neuropsychological and cognitive tasks. So classic ones like the Wisconsin card sorting test, task switching paradigms, working memory tasks, divergent thinking tasks. So classic tasks that we have in the cognitive psychology canon. And then we examine how these relate to other sociopolitical attitudes. So as you can see, these tests are ideology neutral. They are unrelated to ideology in any way, and really are established ones in the literature. So we're not making up anything new on the cognitive side. And so I'll summarize quite a large set of studies here that looked at cognitive inflexibility or rigidity. And the main gist is that ideologues and dogmatic people exhibit reduced cognitive flexibility on these objective, non-ideological cognitive tests relative to non-ideologues or to moderates. And so I'll show a couple examples of the papers where I've examined this. So the first looked at this in the context of political partisanship. And as you can see in the figure, what we find is that people who are on the extreme left and on the extreme right tend to exhibit lower cognitive flexibility on these tasks relative to moderates of both sides in the middle. And so it was quite, this inverted U-shaped curve was quite pronounced and quite amazing to see in objective cognitive tasks. And so it seems that moderate political attitude is also reflected in the more general cognitive flexibility on a number of cognitive tests. Also looked at this in the context of dogmatism, or its reverse, which is intellectual humility, which is an openness to revising one's viewpoints and respect for alternative viewpoints. And again, here we found across a number of tests that cognitive flexibility was positively related to intellectual humility. It also interacted with intelligence in interesting ways, suggesting that intelligence and flexibility are dual routes to achieving a more intellectually humble mindset. And I examined this also in the context of nationalism and Brexit in our PNES paper, also in the context of religiosity and religious belief and religious upbringing. Also looked at this in the context of self-sacrificial tendencies and extremist attitudes. So how much people are more likely to endorse violence or be happy to self-sacrifice their life or aspects of their life for an ideological cause. And we find consistently that these self-sacrificial, somewhat extremist attitudes and tendencies are related to cognitive rigidity on these cognitive tasks. And so we always triangulate using multiple cognitive tasks that are established from the literature to show these findings emerge again and again. And I reviewed this more broadly in political psychologies in recent current opinion in behavioral sciences. And so that's the theory-driven side. But I've also taken more data-driven approaches to the question of the relationship between low-level perception and cognition and susceptibility to dogmatic and ideological thinking. Now, to understand why data-driven approaches are important, it's valuable to have a quick look at the challenges that political psychology is facing. So the first is there have been concerns that researchers in this more political psychology, political neuroscience domain are potentially biased and actually using the field, whether subconsciously or not, to advance their own political agendas. And that's problematic for science, of course. The second component is measurement. And because political psychology emerged from social psychology as opposed to cognitive science, it still relies very heavily on self-reports and rarely uses cognitive and behavioral measures to tap into psychological processes. And that's been an issue in a number of ways. We see that relationships' effect sizes are inflated when we use self-reports, and sometimes actually they even go in opposite directions when we measure them with cognitive tests versus self-report. So really important to understand the distinction between cognitive science methodology and the more self-report social psychology methodology. And actually, within this field, it's quite siloed and balkanized, so that most researchers either work on politics or on religion or on extremism or on obedience or on prejudice. Of course, there are exceptions, but mostly the field is siloed in terms of societies, journals, and so there isn't really a work that looks at it from a holistic perspective, that looks at how psychological traits in a variety of domains relate to ideologies in a variety of flavors. And so the work here that we did, and I'll run through it a little quickly, but the preprint is available and you're very welcome to look, is looking at how we can use data-driven approaches in large data sets to understand ideological cognition. So the basic study design was that in 2016, I collaborated with Russell Poljack at Stanford University to do this, and they already in 2016 had collected a really rich data set where participants completed 22 personality surveys and 37 classic cognitive tasks. And they published some of these results in PNAS and in Nature Communications. And in 2018, I contacted those participants again and tried to see whether they would be happy to answer some questions about their ideological attitudes, and so that we could analyze how cognition and personality might contribute towards ideological attitudes and adherence and dogmatism. And so it's a very complex set of results, but I will just focus on a few of the interesting things here. So the first interesting thing is that we were able to create these data-driven psychological signatures of a large range of ideological attitudes. So really letting the data speak rather than our theories being imposed on our expectations. And this showed us that there are unique signatures for different types of ideologies. So even social conservatism and economic conservatism had a different cognitive and personality kind of signature. And we were able to use some Bayesian analyses to show that actually cognitive tasks really do play a major role, even when we compare them to classic demographic variables, and when we compare them to personality surveys. It seems that cognitive tasks do contribute to a lot of the variance and are variables that are important when predicting these and explaining these, the variation in ideological and dogmatic tendencies. And I'll focus for a second on the finding that I think you might find most interesting, and this is in the context of dogmatism and perceptual decision-making. So amongst the 37 cognitive tasks the participants completed, they completed some classic ones like the Stroop task, Simon task, the dot expectancy task, like the picture on the right, where we have to guess which way dots are moving on the screen. So these are, again, really perceptual classic paradigms that we use in the field. And so when we analyze this kind of data set, just as cognitive scientists, we often use drift diffusion modeling, which is basically an analysis of a trial-by-trial behavior on these tasks where people have to choose just between two choices. So for instance, between stimulus A and stimulus B. And drift diffusion modeling allows us to quantify the decision-making processes that are happening in these basic perceptual paradigms. And what we find in general is that dogmatic participants were slower to process evidence from this perceptual decision environment. That is, the way in which their evidence accumulation processing happened was slower than usual and in this way impaired. And we find this result when we look across on all these tasks, and even especially when we look at task by task analysis, we see this result coming up again and again, suggesting that the dogmatic mind, in the context of politics or in the context of opinions, is also a mind that struggles to process evidence, even sensory evidence. So there seems to be this link between the ideological higher level political realm and the perceptual, which is, I think, quite exciting and fascinating. So if we go quickly back to this cartoon, I think we can see that we can build something fascinating about what makes someone dogmatic, what makes them inquisitive, and as a field we can progress towards more open-mindedness, more intellectual humility by combining theory-driven and data-driven approaches. So as we're seeking to build a cognitive science of ideology and dogmatism, we can see that ideological beliefs are amenable to careful cognitive and computational analysis. Actually, the results also reveal a lot of really interesting differences and similarities between theory-driven work and offer a lot of novel insights and unexplored avenues, for instance, in the context of dogmatism, which seems to really not yet be examined properly. We can see that the data-driven approach can overcome or help comfort us about the dangers of theoretical or researcher biases in the field. And it underscores that we can use cognitive tasks to complement self-report measures of psychological traits, and those contribute unique variants and tap into separable processes that psychologists of all flavors should be really interested in. So we can begin to illuminate the cognitive characteristics of the dogmatic and the ideological mind, and in that process also start to understand the open-minded brain and the one who's more resistant to dogmas and doctrines and ideologies. So thank you very much. You're very welcome to contact me via all these channels, and I look forward to your questions.